Ed McMahon held the cue card with trembling fingers. 7 words. Just 7 simple words written in black marker that would shatter the composure of America's most beloved television host. Johnny Carson, the man who had kept the nation laughing for decades, suddenly couldn't speak. The Tonight Show's studio fell into a silence so profound that even the camera operators stopped breathing. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not on live television. Not to Johnny Carson. But sometimes the most powerful moments in television history happen when the script gets thrown away, when the carefully orchestrated world of show business collides with raw human emotion. And that night, in Studio 6B at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, America witnessed something they had never seen before, their unflappable king of late-night television completely vulnerable, completely human. What happened next would change not just The Tonight Show, but how America understood the power of television to heal, to connect, and to remind us that behind every public figure is a person carrying private pain. It was October 15, 1987. Johnny Carson walked onto The Tonight Show set with his usual confident stride, straightening his tie as he approached his desk. The audience applauded with their familiar warmth, and Doc Severinsen's band played the opening notes of the show's iconic theme. Everything seemed routine, normal, exactly as it had been for the past 25 years. But Johnny wasn't the same man who had started that week. 3 days earlier, he had received news that would shake anyone to their core. His youngest son, Rick, had been struggling with personal demons that Johnny, despite all his success and influence, couldn't fix. The phone call from the hospital came at 3 a.m. Rick had been in a car accident, and while he survived, the circumstances surrounding it revealed just how deep his troubles ran. Johnny Carson had built his career on being unflappable. The master of the perfectly timed pause, the raised eyebrow, the ability to turn any awkward moment into comedy gold. But sitting behind his desk that Thursday night, with millions of Americans tuning in for their nightly dose of laughter, Johnny felt the weight of being a father who didn't know how to save his own son. The monologue began as it always did. Johnny delivering his opening jokes with practiced precision, the audience responding on cue. But those who knew him well, Ed McMahon, Doc Severinsen, the longtime crew members, could see something different in his eyes. A distance. A heaviness that no amount of stage lights could illuminate away. "You know," Johnny said, departing from his prepared material, "people often ask me what it's like to be on television every night, to have this platform to reach so many people." He paused, longer than usual. "But sometimes I wonder if we're really connecting, or if we're just performing." The audience laughed, thinking it was set up for a punchline. But no punchline came. Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. Ed McMahon, who had been Johnny's loyal sidekick for over 2 decades, sensed something was wrong. During the commercial break, he approached Johnny's desk with a concerned look. In his hand was a cue card that wasn't part of the show's script, something that had been delivered to the studio just minutes before they went live. "Johnny," Ed said quietly, "this came for you." The young man who delivered it said it was urgent. Johnny took the card, expecting perhaps a last-minute change from the producers or a note about a scheduling conflict. Instead, he found 7 handwritten words that would stop his heart. "Dad, I'm sorry. Please don't give up." The message was from Rick. Somehow, from his hospital bed, Johnny's son had managed to get this message to the studio. 7 words that carried a lifetime of regret, hope, and love. Johnny stared at the card for what felt like an eternity. The audience, now back from commercial break, waited for him to continue the show. The cameras rolled. America watched. And Johnny Carson, for the first time in his professional career, forgot where he was. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. When they came back from commercial, Johnny was supposed to introduce his first guest, a comedian promoting a new movie. Instead, he remained seated behind his desk, the cue card still in his hands. Ed McMahon took his position next to Johnny's desk, but instead of delivering his usual hearty, "Here's Johnny!" energy, he simply stood there, watching his friend process something profound. "Ed," Johnny said, his voice barely above a whisper, "do you ever think about the things we don't say to the people we love?" The question hung in the air. This wasn't part of any script. The producers in the control room were frantically trying to figure out what was happening. Should they cut to commercial? Should they signal Johnny to get back on track? But Ed McMahon, in a moment of instinctive wisdom, made a choice that no producer would have ever scripted. Instead of trying to redirect Johnny back to the show, he leaned in closer and said, "Tell me about it, Johnny." Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. And so, on live television, watched by millions of Americans, Johnny Carson began to talk about his son. Not as a punchline, not as material for a monologue, but as a father who was scared, confused, and desperately hoping for a second chance. "My son Rick," Johnny began, his voice growing stronger, "has been struggling with some personal issues. And tonight he sent me a message." He held up the cue card. 7 words that reminded me why I do this job, why any of us do what we do. The studio audience, initially confused by this departure from the usual format, began to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't entertainment in the traditional sense. This was real life unfolding on their television screens. Johnny looked directly into camera one, speaking not to his audience of millions, but to his son watching from a hospital bed across the country. "Rick, if you're watching this, and I know you are, I want you to know that I haven't given up. I will never give up on you. And I'm sorry too. Sorry for all the times I chose this career over being the father you needed. Sorry for thinking that providing for you was the same as being present for you." Doc Severinsen, understanding the gravity of the moment, softly cued the band to play a gentle, almost inaudible musical backdrop. Not for entertainment, but for support. Ed McMahon, his own eyes beginning to well up, placed a gentle hand on Johnny's shoulder. "Johnny," he said, "would you like me to read those 7 words to everyone?" Johnny nodded, unable to speak. Ed took the cue card with the reverence of someone handling something sacred. He looked out at the studio audience, then directly into the camera, and in his clear, powerful voice read, "Dad, I'm sorry. Please don't give up." But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. The silence that followed was unlike anything in television history. It wasn't the silence of technical difficulty or awkward pause. It was the silence of recognition, millions of people understanding that they had just witnessed something profound about love, forgiveness, and the courage to be vulnerable in front of the world. Then, slowly, one person in the studio audience began to clap. Not the thunderous applause that usually followed Johnny's monologues, but a slow, respectful acknowledgement of a moment that transcended entertainment. Soon, others joined in, until the entire studio was filled with the sound of people recognizing something real, something human, something that reminded them of their own complicated relationships with the people they loved. Johnny Carson, the man who had made a career out of making others laugh, sat behind his desk and cried. Not from sadness, but from a mixture of love, regret, hope, and gratitude. Gratitude that his son had reached out, that Ed had supported him, that somehow, in this moment of complete vulnerability, he felt more connected to his audience than ever before. "You know," Johnny said, finally finding his voice again, "I've been doing this show for 25 years. I've interviewed presidents, movie stars, authors, athletes. I've told thousands of jokes, shared countless laughs. But tonight, I want to talk about something more important than any of that. I want to talk about not giving up on the people we love, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." He looked around the studio, at Ed, at Doc, at the crew members who had become his extended family over the decades. We all have someone in our lives who might need to hear that we're not giving up on them. Someone who might need to know that it's never too late to say "I'm sorry" or "I love you" or "please try again." The show that night didn't follow its usual format. Instead of comedy sketches and celebrity interviews, it became something unprecedented, a late-night television therapy session for an entire nation. Phone lines at NBC lit up not with complaints, but with people sharing their own stories of family struggles, of words left unsaid, of second chances and forgiveness. Johnny never did introduce his scheduled guests that night. Instead, he spent the remaining time reading some of the messages that were being delivered to the studio, messages from viewers who were inspired by his vulnerability to reach out to their own family members, to have conversations they had been putting off, to take chances on healing relationships that seemed beyond repair. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The impact of that night extended far beyond the studio walls. In hospitals across the country, patients called family members they hadn't spoken to in years. In living rooms, parents hugged their children a little tighter. In college dorms, students picked up phones to call home, not because they needed money or help, but because they wanted to say, "I love you," while they still could. Rick Carson, watching from his hospital bed, later said that seeing his father's vulnerability on television gave him the courage to begin his own journey toward healing. The 7 words he had written, "Dad, I'm sorry. Please don't give up," became the foundation for a conversation between father and son that had been decades in the making. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on Johnny Carson himself. That night, he discovered that his greatest moment as a television host hadn't come from a perfectly delivered joke or a clever interview. It had come from being completely, authentically human in front of millions of people. The cue card with Rick's 7 words was framed and kept in Johnny's dressing room for the remainder of his tenure on The Tonight Show. Crew members would often see him looking at it before tapings, not as a source of sadness, but as a reminder of what really mattered. Years later, when Johnny Carson retired from The Tonight Show, he kept that cue card. And when younger television hosts would ask him for advice about handling the pressures of fame and the demands of nightly television, he would tell them about that October night in 1987. "Television," he would say, "gives us the power to reach into people's homes, into their hearts. But sometimes the most important thing we can do with that power is simply be honest about our own struggles, our own humanity. Because when we do that, we remind everyone watching that they're not alone in theirs." The 7 words that Rick Carson wrote to his father that night, "Dad, I'm sorry. Please don't give up," became more than just a personal message between a father and son. They became a testament to the power of vulnerability, the importance of second chances, and the reminder that sometimes the most profound moments in our lives happen when we stop performing and start being real. And sometimes, those moments happen on live television, watched by millions of people who desperately needed to see that even their heroes are human, even their heroes struggle, and even their heroes need forgiveness and love. The letters that poured into NBC in the weeks following that broadcast filled entire rooms. Parents wrote about reconciling with estranged children. Children wrote about finding the courage to forgive their parents. Veterans shared stories about finally calling the brothers in arms they had lost touch with. Teachers described how they had started each day differently, looking at their students not just as pupils, but as whole human beings carrying invisible struggles. Johnny Carson had inadvertently created a movement of vulnerability and connection that rippled through American culture. Late-night television, which had always been about escape and entertainment, suddenly became a medium for healing and human connection. Other talk show hosts began incorporating more genuine moments into their programs, understanding that audiences craved authenticity as much as they craved laughter. The psychological impact on Johnny himself was equally profound. For years he had struggled with the isolation that comes with fame, the feeling that people loved Johnny Carson the character, but could never know Johnny Carson the man. That night, by allowing his private pain to become public, he discovered that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was the bridge to genuine human connection. Rick Carson's recovery wasn't immediate or simple, but that night marked the beginning of a father-son relationship built on honesty rather than performance. They would spend the remaining years of Johnny's life having the conversations they had avoided for decades, learning to see each other not as the roles they played, but as the flawed, loving, complicated people they actually were. That night, Johnny Carson didn't just host The Tonight Show. He showed America that it's okay to break down, It's okay to be vulnerable, and it's okay to admit that sometimes we don't have all the answers. But we can still choose not to give up on each other. And that, perhaps, was his greatest performance of all.